Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everyone to our weekly Art Politics Lab session. I'm really happy with our speaker today, Lene Aarøe, and I'm really happy to see all of you again. And let me introduce the speaker before my voice gives out. I'm really happy to have Lene Aarøe here from Aarhus University. She's an associate professor there. She's been working in political psychology with specifically an evolutionary psychology angle for quite a while now. And you know, if she isn't the first person on your reference list in political psychology, you're doing something wrong. Lene has a number of excellent publications on a wide range of different topics, and recently quite a bit of work on the behavioral immune system and how that shapes your preferences in politics, work on framing, but also stuff like co-lawfer. That was very interesting. Work on birth weight, blood glucose levels. I mean, if you think Bert and I do crazy stuff, then you should really meet Lene here. And I mean crazy, obviously, in the most positive connotation that it has. So today, she will talk about evolved psychological biases. And I think this is relatively new work. At least I haven't seen it yet. So I'm really curious. For those of you new today, our speakers typically talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A, and you can type your questions into the Q&A box. I will shut up now and give the floor to Lene.
Well, thank you, Heis, and thank you for that fantastic introduction. I'm really proud to be among crazy people. I understand that to be in a positive sense. So it's Friday afternoon. So I'm going to begin with a guy who had a really bad week. And here I'm not only referring to the fact that he was infected with the coronavirus, but to another issue that appeared earlier this week. So earlier this week, the New York Times broke the story about the most recent story about Trump's tax revenue and the lack of income tax that he's paying. This is not a new issue. There's been a long line of debate about the extent to which Trump is contributing to American society by paying his taxes as the billionaire he claims to be, or whether in fact he is a free rider or simply just a lousy businessman who has completely overclaimed his image as a competent leader. Either way, whether he's a tax cheater or simply completely incompetent, this has been a political issue that has catched the attention of not only Americans, but also media around the globe. I have here screenshots of stories from French media, and to those of you who are a bit unfamiliar with Danish, it's not Dutch with spelling mistakes, but an original article from national Danish media. The story even went beyond the elite level and was also shared massively on social media. Here an example of the sharing of a campaign video from the Biden campaign that has over 4 million displays, a huge number of sharings that also echoes to Trump's tax scandal. So what is it about those scandals that display or reveal that politicians might not only be working for the better good of society, but also are working to promote their own image, to serve their own electoral success, or simply to maximize their own economic benefit? Why are they so dangerous to politicians that it leads us to intuitively conclude that Trump had a really bad week? And why are we all aware of these political issues? Not only with Trump, we could also mention Emailgate that Hillary Clinton suffered during the past American election. And when we think about our own national context, very quickly scandals about politicians that have behaved and acted self-serving in one way or another comes to mind. So why is it that citizens who Kinder have characterized as awash in ignorance have such a great eye for this type of political issues, remember them so well, and engage so vividly with them? Well, a classical perspective on this from the political science literature is that, well, it's because of the role of the media. It's because journalists, due to competitive pressures and political news criteria, are so focused on this type of strategic political news. Another typical explanation that we hear in the political science literature, that it's due to negative campaigning and the bad standards of competitive politics. While those explanations are certainly part of the broader picture, it's important to highlight that in politics, people don't only access information from political elites, they also hear it from peers in their social networks. Social media like Twitter and Facebook and Reddit are modern manifestations of the importance of interpersonal communication to the flow of information about politics more broadly. So already back in the classical work of Katz and Lazarsfeld, there was the observation that the flow of political communication sort of has this two-step nature to it. It originates from political elites and is then transmitted to opinion leaders and ordinary citizens who spread it in their social networks. So what happens in this second step of the communication flow? Well, overall, the cognitive tasks to citizens become more complex. When we read news directly from the media or hear them directly from politicians, then there is a professional packaging of the news story. When we recollect that news among ourselves, well, then it's a completely different story. Then we are left to our own skills to explain what the issue is about. We have to remember what the issue was about. We have to recompose the story, and we have to fill in the blanks that we cannot remember. So in that process, obviously, information will get lost. So a standard social science approach to understanding what goes on in the second step of the communication flow is that, well, citizens, to the best of their ability, try to copy the elite information, but due to their limited cognitive skills and limited motivation for politics, information will get lost. Recent research published in the APSR by Taylor Carlson supports the relevance of that idea. The figure that I'm showing here are results where Taylor followed how the US Bureau of Economic Analysis report was transmitted. The solid black line shows the similarity between the original or the original official report and news articles about the report. A score of 1 would indicate full similarity. The dashed line shows the similarity between Reuters news articles about the report and citizens' recollections when they were asked to write recollections of selected news articles from Reuters. Consistent with the idea that information gets lost in the second step of the communication flow, we can see that similarity between citizens' recollections and the media coverage is much lower than the similarity between the media coverage and the original report. So did I just mistime my talk? I had 5 minutes to say that, well, there's a second step to the communication flow, but really what happens is a weak copy of the first step of the communication flow, only that citizens are much worse at it. No, I didn't. It wasn't a mistiming. I have to. I have more to add to this story. So, an evolutionary psychological perspective will highlight that it might be that in modern politics, in some respects, citizens are awash in ignorance, but actually our species do have a big and deep history for dealing with politics and for processing the types of cues that have been relevant ancestrally when dealing with issues related to politics in our evolutionary environment. So that suggests that there has been in place a selection pressure for the development of deep-seated psychological biases for encoding that type of politically relevant cues, for encoding them, storing them in long-term memory, and for retrieving them and broadcasting them to others. So that suggests that even though our competences overall are limited, then exactly the type of information that fits those evolved biases for politics will be transmitted more reliably and will have stronger impact in our evaluations. So to be more concrete, excellent literature documents that over our evolutionary history, cooperation has been a key strategy for survival for our species. For example, when hunting for food, when foraging, when trying to protect against outgroups and predators, cooperation has been a key strategy for survival. However, cooperation is only an adaptive strategy if you can guard against free riders. So that suggests that our mind is equipped with deep-seated psychological mechanisms to detect free riders, that is, cheaters that act antisocially to serve their own interest instead of contributing as reciprocators to the group. So that suggests that we have a deep ability to encode and store in long-term memory and retrieve from long-term memory information about free riders, that is, self-interested other individuals, and that we, as part of the mechanism to guard ourselves against such cheaters or free riders, also have a strong motivation to broadcast such information to others. Now, integrating that into to the literature on why stories about politicians that act in a way to serve their own personal interest in an economic way, in an image building way, well, that suggests that citizens actually, in the second step of the communication flow, do play an active role in the dissemination of such information. There are various types of political information in modern information flows that fits these deep-seated psychological mechanisms for transmitting information about self-serving others. Conspiracy theories often focus about how self-serving elites conspire against the public. Negative campaigning also have as a typical content strategy to display political opponents as corrupt or self-serving. Think again just about Trump's corrupt Hillary campaign from the past election. Finally, we also have strategic news frames that constitute a generic type of political news framing that typically characterize politicians as motivated by the interest to serve their own career, to display a good image, rather than to pursue politics and the general interest of society. So while this latter form, strategic news framing, might not be the most extreme form of political information about self-interested politicians, it's one of the most common and prevalent forms. So in the sort of empirical test of this evolved transmission bias for encoding and sharing information about self-serving politicians that I'm going to test in the last part of the talk, I'm going to focus on the transmission of strategy-framed news stories. So a direct observable implication of the transmission bias is that in the second step of the communication flow, people will encode and share strategy-framed news to a larger extent and more elaborately than traditional issue frames that focus on the political content that the politicians present. In terms of the implications of those transmitted stories in interpersonal communication for preference formation, well, then the transmission bias suggests that these socially transmitted strategy-framed news stories, that they should have a negative effect on trust in politicians and policy approval, and that these effects should apply relatively generally across individual differences in political sophistication, as that could be a possible consequence if these biases are deep-seated. So to test this, we implement a method from cognitive psychology in large-scale online surveys. This design is called the chain transmission design. Some people will know this as a technically advanced version of the children's game Telephone, or what we would call in Danish whisper game. So specifically, we implemented 2 consecutive online surveys on MTurk. Participants who participated in the first study was ineligible to participate in the second survey. In the first survey, participants were randomly assigned to one of 2 experiments, the quantity experiment and the frequency experiment. So in the quantity experiment, participants were randomly assigned to read a political news article about a new proposal to fight unemployment from a politician named Scott Harris. Participants then read either a strategy-framed version of the news story or an issue-framed version of the news story. The strategy-framed version of the news story emphasized that Harris presented this proposal to improve his own image in the electorate, that the policy proposal was specifically targeted to benefit his own voters in his own home state, Virginia, and that his motivation for presenting this proposal was electoral success. In contrast, the issue frame emphasized that Harris' motivation for presenting the proposal was to fight the unemployment caused by global competitive pressures against the US. As dependent variables, we measured the respondents' policy support for the proposal after they had read the frame. We measured their trust in Harris, and importantly, we asked them to write a recollection of the news story that they had read. They were instructed to write the recollection as accurately as possible, but we also told them that, of course, it was okay that they couldn't remember everything, but that they should include as much as they remembered as possible in their recollection. The respondents, perhaps needless to say, wrote the recollection on a new screen where they could not access the original treatment article. In the frequency experiment, well, then their participants were all assigned to read a non-political news story. It was a movie review that was the content of that story. And then they were randomly assigned to read either a strategy-framed or an issue-framed political news story. We used the same 2 stories about Harris's policy proposal as in the quantity experiment. As dependent variables in this experiment, again, we measured policy support and trust in Harris, and we asked respondents which of the 2 stories, the non-political or the political, they would want to recollect to another participant in the survey. And then finally, they were also asked to write a recollection of the story. The second round, that is the second survey, had exactly the same setup, except that participants as input, instead of reading the original news articles, they were randomly assigned to read recollections of the original news articles, those recollections that were produced in the first survey. Now, what did we find? Were the strategy frames news stories transmitted to a higher extent than the issue-framed news stories? The figure here shows first in the upper panel the number of words that were transmitted by the frame condition, and the lower panel shows the percentage who chose to transmit the political news article over the movie review, again by frame condition. Our results show that in the strategy framed condition, respondents recollected a larger number of words than in the issue framed condition. That's consistent with the transmission bias. We also, our findings also show that in the first round, a larger percentage of the respondents chose to transmit the strategy framed news story over the movie review compared to the percentage who chose to transmit the issue framed news story. However, that difference was only statistically significant in the first round, and it suggests that the transmission bias is most robust when people receive the full length of the original news story, as they will, for example, when they share news stories on social media. Now, the number of words is a first clean indicator of the content that was transmitted, but sort of leaves the actual content of the news stories as quite a black box. So the next figure here shows the results of an automatic content analysis of the content of the recollections of the strategy frame and the issue frame. And we can see, sort of consistent with the idea of a transmission bias favoring encoding and sharing of information about politicians' self-serving motives, that the recollections of the strategy frame really focused on Harris' motivation for re-election, his intention to benefit voters in his own home state, Virginia, whereas recollections of the issue frame focused on the issue, the substance of the policy proposal, how it was motivated to fight global competitive pressures. We can also see, consistent with the idea of this deep-seated psychological transmission bias for information about self-serving others, that the content representing the storyline in the strategy frame is more elaborate, richer than the content representing the storyline in the issue frame. Finally, based on human coding of the content of the recollection, we also analyze the survival rate of key content elements from the original strategy framed news story and the original issue framed news story. And those results show that the content element of the strategy framed news story survived to a significantly larger extent through the interpersonal transmission than the issue framed content. That's also consistent with the idea that we have this deep-seated bias for encoding and sharing exactly that type of information. So, okay, so the transmission bias tells us something about what people talk about in the second step of the communication flow, but does it have more direct political implication? That's the last set of results that I'm going to show today. So the figure here shows the effect of the strategy framed and the issue framed news story and the recollections of the news stories in round 1 and round 2 respectively on trust in Harris, first panel on policy support, and finally more broadly on trust in Congress. And we can see that both in the first and the second transmission round, strategy framed news stories, whether it's the original elite stories or the recollections, they drive down trust in Harris, they drive down support for his policy, but the effect is not does not extend in a statistically significant way to trust in Congress. Prior experimental research on effects of different types of stimuli on general political trust generally shows that overall or general political trust is relatively stable. So in that way, our findings there are consistent with that literature. There it was. So to wrap up, I hope I have highlighted that it's relevant to pay attention to the second step of the communication flow, where citizens transmit information about politics. Because in the second step of the communication flow, while information loss is part of what is going on, there's also a bias, a systematic bias in the type of information that survives and gets transmitted. Our findings support that citizens have deep-seated evolved biases for transmitting information about self-serving others. That is information that fits evolved biases for cheater detection. I have other work with other co-authors that also evolved biases for negativity and evolved biases for vivid information. So that supports the underlying idea that the types of political information that survives in the second step of the communication flow is not random, but indeed shaped by deep-seated evolved psychological biases. That was it.
Okay, thank you very much, Lene, for this really interesting talk. And as people who have been here before know, you can ask questions to Lene via the Q&A box, and then I will read them out loud, and Lene will answer them. So there are already some questions. So let's just start, Lene. The first is from Amanda Friesen. Hi, Lene. I was wondering if you have looked at cognitive complexity or other dictionary-based elements of the open-ended responses.
Well, thank you, Amanda. That's a really interesting question. We haven't looked at cognitive complexity. In part because we started this project 5 years ago, where that technology was less developed than today, and B, probably because we didn't think about it, as we are not that IT savvy. But it's a super interesting suggestion to look more into.
All right, thanks. The second question is from Rens Vliegendhart from Amsterdam School of Communication Research. Thanks, Lene, for this interesting talk. I was wondering whether you have any idea what would happen if strategy and issue frames are combined into a single news item. Would including both to a certain degree or both yield including both to a certain degree yield an optimal outcome in terms of recall and trust/support?
Well, the question Rens is raising sort of leads me to emphasize that in the classic cognitive and social psychological literature that has previously implemented the chain transmission design, sort of the classical way of implementing it is actually to present respondents simultaneously with two competing types of information, one that fits psychological biases and another type that doesn't fit. Where the overall prediction is that in that competitive situation, information that fits psychological biases will survive. So based on that, my prediction would be that in such a competitive or dual framing situation, transmission of the strategy relevant features that portray politicians' self-serving motivations would outcompete the issue frame part, so that a dual framing would not lead to an ideal transmission of information. We chose to present the frames separately instead of as the dual frame to increase internal validity in our analysis.
Excellent, thanks, Lene. Question from Iran Amsalen. Lene, thank you. Did you have a control group to which the strategy and issue framed conditions are compared? I would assume that not all political news articles are issue and strategy. Also, are you thinking about writing a recollection as comparable Are you thinking about writing a recollection as comparable to face-to-face discussions? Much of the communication occurring in networks is probably done offline, friends, family, co-workers, etc.
These are really relevant points. So we don't have a control condition, which of course leaves some ambiguity to interpretation of the findings. It's difficult from an experimental perspective to implement a control group, especially in the part of the analysis that focuses on what types of information people recollect, because that does require an informational input. In a way, while we haven't talked so explicitly about it, in a way, I think we reason about the issue frame as our control group because it presents the information that does not fit the deep-seated psychological bias. So to some extent, that is then the control condition, where the treatment condition is the strategy frame that does fit the evolved psychological biases. Of course, then a conceptual discussion is whether there is a neutral frame that represents the middle ground between the generic issue frame and the generic strategy frame. You're right that not all frames are necessarily either issue or strategy frame information, but it does represent a central generic distinction between different types of news stories or news frames, if we want to stick to the framing concept. There was a final part of the question, Bert, that I cannot remember.
Yeah, there's a second question.
Really cool.
No. There's two. There's the second question. The second question was: are you thinking about writing a recollection is that comparable to face-to-face discussions? So much of the communication occurring in networks is probably done offline, friends, family, co-workers.
I think that's, I knew it was cool. I think that's a really relevant point and limitation to the work that I'm presenting here, that we can speak to the context where people write recollections of news stories. But as you say, in current days, interpersonal face-to-face communication is probably as common. And there are other evolutionary relevant types of cues that are present in the face-to-face communication. So I think taking this to other communication channels would be highly relevant, and also varying information about the receiver of the recollection. Our instruction was, because we wanted really to tap that, whether ability and motivation to broadcast strategy relevant information is stronger, because we were interested in that. Our instruction was that respondents should copy as exactly as they were able to another participant in the study. But in an ecologically valid context, you don't copy to another participant, you copy to a known receiver in interpersonal communication. So what are the consequences of knowing that you communicate to an in-partisan, to a high politically sophisticated person, or a low politically sophisticated person? There are several theoretically relevant receiver characteristics to explore and implement in the instruction. So I think that's very obvious next steps.
Yes, thanks, Lene. Next question is from our own Matthijs Roduin. Thank you for this interesting and clear presentation. I like your point of departure and the focus on the idea that the mind is equipped psychologically with mechanisms to detect self-serving free riders a lot. However, I was wondering to what extent the results indeed confirm that this is the case. How do we know that the results are indeed due to this mechanism? Aren't the findings also in line with other, maybe simpler explanations, such as the negativity bias?
That's a really good point. So in the paper, which you really should go and check out, we have additional analysis where we do mediation analysis, where we look at at the mediational effect of content that focuses on portraying Harris as a cheater. That's one operationalization. We have also so that's one operationalization. We have an alternative operationalization of strategy-framed news contents, where we measure it as content focusing on Harris's self-serving motivations, and we investigate the mediating role of those variables, controlling for negativity, controlling for emotionality, and those analysis supports the key mediating role of exactly focus on Harris's self-serving motivations in our analysis. So acknowledging the limitations that exist to mediational analysis, in my view, that's further results that supports the interpretation in favor of evolved biases for exactly information relevant to cheater detection mechanisms, rather than a broader evolved bias or negative information per se.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Nikolai Berg. Thank you for your excellent talk and very clever design. First, a question of clarification. Does words transmitted refer to the absolute number of words written, or to the overlap between the recollection and the original article? Let's just start with the first.
It refers to the overall number of words transmitted. The news stories were constructed so that the strategy frame story and the issue frame story had the same length, and they had the same linguistic complexity as indexed by, I think it's the Lix number, also in English. So in that way, with a relatively high internal validity, we can analyze whether participants in the strategy framed condition transmitted a higher number of words. But of course, that analysis only says something about the number of words and not about the content in those words.
And the second question from Nikolai is this. Second, is a simpler explanation for these findings not given by the general expectation of politicians to serve a representational role in democracies? And if violated, there's a stronger urge to communicate this.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. I guess sort of my counter question would then be, why is there such a relatively universal ideal then across democracies that politicians should serve the common good rather than their own interests? Why is that norm so widespread across different political systems and different political cultures? This meeting is being recorded, that exactly our attention against self-serving politicians is particularly sharp.
Thank you, Lene. Sorry, I think there was some technical difficulties with our connection from Vienna, but this is an excellent answer. Our anonymous attendee who has a question for you. Thank you for the interesting talk. At the start of the presentation, you talked about Trump's tax. At the start of the presentation, you talked about Trump's tax scandal and briefly mentioned Hillary Clinton's email scandal. Would you expect different types of scandals to be more easily remembered than other than others from an evolutionary perspective? Or am I reading too much into the brief mention of Clinton?
I think you're reading a bit too much into the mention of Clinton. That example wasn't as strategically chosen from me, but more as another follow-up that I expected that an international audience, as we have here today, would all recognize and relate to. Overall, work by, for example, Dunbar, Masudi, and Witten in social psychology emphasizes that as part of relation building in groups and group coordination, we have an evolved disposition for gossiping about social information. So that suggests at a very basic level that vivid social information of the types that would inhere in small scale societies, in small scale group living, is information that we have an evolved bias for. But within that quite broad category of information that we would term episodic framing in modern communication language, episodic framing, exemplar communication. Within that broad category, some types of information fit additional evolved psychological biases, such as the psychological bias for cheater detection. So I would expect that also within the broad category of vivid social information, some types of communication would be transmitted more reliably and to a larger extent, so that there would be differences across different types of political scandals.
Great, thanks. I also have a question, Lene. Thanks for this great talk. Maybe this is the question is about the dependent variable and sort of the effect sizes that you find here. So is sort of trust in the politician, isn't that sort of the most likely case where we would see some movement? And the fact that you don't see it, for instance, on the Congress in general, might be because you're partly moving the subject away much more broader. But my question is like, if this is really sort of tapping into my evolutionary core, should I not want to do more to Harris than just say I don't trust him anymore? Because this might be a bit, especially coming from the University of Amsterdam, like trust is very important, but on the other hand, like what are the political consequences of not trusting Harris? I'm not 100% sure what that is. So would we not expect that politicians might punish that voters might punish, like costly punishments or other things like really trying to hurt him? And on the other hand, if the effects on trust are so small, is that what we should expect to happen, or is it really not that important? What we find here. So is the effects too small to really move people into like sort of costly behavior?
Well, these are super relevant points, Bert, to explore further. I think that as your question is probably already indirectly suggesting, that an additional observable implication should be that people would be less likely to vote for Harris. I don't know if that's then my self-serving biases that lead me to think that maybe we actually have that result in the supplementary material. I'm not 100% sure, but I definitely think the prediction is valid. When it comes to effects on trust, I'm in two mindsets. On the one hand, I agree with you that effect sizes are not that large. So how relevant is this really? And compared to the first step of the communication flow, we see also a decline in effect sizes. Perhaps not statistically significant, but the tendency is there, so that could be a power issue. On the other hand, as scholars working with the trust experiments might to some extent agree on, trust is relatively stable, so that the fact that it moves in response to this type of treatment, I think shows something that's relatively important compared to many of the hypotheses we try out. That would be a modest way of talking about it. And finally, there would be the classical follow-up question, that is that, okay, so we investigate effects of one single article, but as I talked about in the beginning of my talk, strategy framing is one of the most prevalent forms of political communication. So people don't get one story. In the case of Trump, they kind of get them almost every day, a new scandal about his self-serving motives. So what is the long-term effect of multiple exposures for some politicians about the same politician, and multiple exposure for multiple politicians? I think that's also relevant to clarify further whether effects multiply or whether people simply become robust.
Thanks. Gijs also has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Lene. It's always nice to see how you come up with these very creative research questions and designs, and then I think this is a very interesting result, and you know, I buy into the result, but I think there is a big paradox, and that is that if we have such nicely evolved psychological mechanisms of cheater detections, why do we have so many cheaters in politics? Right? It's not only Donald Trump, of course. I mean, there are a lot of them, and for some of them, it's just minor stuff. But there does seem to be a tendency, especially among powerful people. I mean, that's also experimental research, to cheat. Right? Sometimes literally cheat on their wives or husbands, or cheat with their taxes or whatever. So how do you sort of reconcile your findings with those findings?
Why do we have so many cheaters in politics? Well, that's a really interesting question to think about, Gijs. Politics is extremely competitive, so it does. Research shows that it does attract people with a certain type of personality, including some tendency for narcissistic and dominant personalities. There are also some benefits to acting in a self-serving way. It is indeed a strategy for maximizing your own good. So the individual politician, of course, makes a trade-off. The risk, the potential cost and risk of being detected against the gains from acting in a self-serving way. And how that trade-off comes out is probably heavily influenced by deep-seated, deep personality traits. It's then, I guess, an empirical question, and something I haven't studied a lot. How many of those politicians who then get detected, who suffer electoral loss, and who eventually have to leave politics because of political failure. And finally, I think from an evolutionary perspective that it's relevant to think more about how evolved biases for cheater detection, when activated against political leaders, interact with our evolved coalitional psychology. To what extent it might lead us to be more forgiving towards our own leaders until a certain threshold, so that also constitute a potentially relevant moderating variable. On the other hand, again, from an evolved perspective, cheaters within your in-group do constitute an adaptive problem. So it could only be until a certain threshold that your conditional psychology provides forgivingness.
I guess it depends on which system you are cheating. Right, there's an alternative branch of sort of leadership psychology, which isn't, I think, based at all in evolutionary reasoning, but there they say that there are sort of, they talk about rule-breaking leaders, and they say there are conditions under which rule-breaking leaders can be more supported, particularly by people with low SCS conditions.
Oh, that's super interesting. I'm not familiar with that literature, but that sounds extremely relevant to the puzzle that you're raising.
Yeah. So the one of the key authors on this is Gerben van Kleef.
Lene, continuing a little bit along that line, this MTurk study, these experiments were done sort of unconditional of any partisan affiliation, as I understand it correctly, right?
Well, actually, we did have an additional factor in the experiment where we manipulated the information about Scott Harris's party ID. In half of the conditions, he was presented as a Republican, and in the other half of the condition, he was presented as a Democrat.
And what happens then?
Well, nothing happens, but our analysis suggests that it's inconclusive what's going on. We looked at whether effects were moderated by a match in party identification between the receivers of the news stories and the recollections, respectively, and Harris's party ID. We find no statistically significant moderating effects, but subsequent equivalence testing that we are doing indicate that we cannot, that we do not have the power, or based on the power we have, we cannot reject moderation effects of party identification. I think in the relatively smallest effect size span that we test.
Yeah, because it would be kind of a nice way of testing two competing sort of works that you based on your partisanship work with Leone Huddy and Lily Mason. You would expect that there might be some outgroup anger, right? Sort of but on the other hand, you could also argue that a cheater from the out party, that's just more negative information that already aligns with a just general negative effect, that it's actually the in party cheating that is considered as more offensive. So is there a way, I could see that you have the power issue with the sample size you work, but is there a way of getting at this maybe at the open-ended sort of the thoughts? Is this like, this is a typical Republican just doing things that Republicans always do, as being a Democrat, or vice versa as a Republican? Is there a way of at least sort of getting a little bit more of a hint of that?
Well, that could actually be quite interesting to code the recollections for whether sort of the reasoning underlying or the interpretation of the fact that Harris is self-serving, whether it varies for in-partisans and out-partisans, the way of rationalizing why he's a cheater. We haven't looked into that because our focus has been very much on detecting how much of the original information is copied. But I think that could be a feasible and really interesting way to look into what is going on with partisanship. Can we learn more, despite that we have a large but too limited sample size to dig it into it with moderation analysis?
Yeah, you're right. Especially if you go on, if you would do more studies along this, I have the sense that you're going to do more on this line of work, so it could give you a hint of whether or not this is a line you want to explore further.
Definitely, but it would absolutely be very cool on that journey to have collaborators with good knowledge on how to do content analysis, both human coded and in an automated way. Because a deep experience from this project has also been that, oh my God, it's interesting but time consuming.
Yeah, that you start to appreciate the Likert scale more, right?
Yes. Don't write anything.
Okay, so I actually have a last question, or
no, it's just time to wrap. Okay, thanks a lot, Lene. You will, as all our speakers, you will get our infamous Hot Politics Lab coffee mug. I'm looking for it, but it seems I've actually cleaned up. So we'll probably with a delay of, I don't know, half a year when I'm allowed back into my office. So, but I'm hoping to give it to you personally at a future date. Last thing, I want to briefly announce the two things. First of all, we are looking for a postdoc, and so there's a job ad, a formal job ad now out on the UvA website, and we're looking for a postdoc for 16 months to work with us. And broadly, you should work on the theme of emotions and politics, but you can apply a lot of different methods or work on specific issues if you like. That it's up to you. More details are in the ad, or feel free to shoot me an email. Okay, then the schedule for the remainder of October. Yes, it's October already. Next week, 9 October, we have Manos Tsakiris from Royal Holloway, University of London. He's a neuroscientist, and he will give a talk titled Experimenting with the Visceral Dimension of Visual Politics. Really looking forward to this. Next week, the week after that, 16th of October, we have Robert Clemenson from the University of Southern Denmark with also a fascinating talk titled Elites, Are They Different? Finally, at the end of October 30th, we have a PhD Friday, Graduate Friday again with Isabella Rabasso and Neil Fasci. That also means that 23 October, there is no Hot Politics Lab because Bert and I need a break. Okay, thanks everyone for listening, and hope to see you next week. Same time, same channel.